Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is John Allen, and I'm the president of the Brookings Institution. It's a great pleasure that I welcome you all today to today's featured speaker, Jake Sullivan, who's the National Security Advisor to President Joe Biden. Sadly, we only have a short time this morning, so my introductory remarks will be short. But Jake joins us only hours after the first, albeit virtual, meeting between the U.S. President Joe Biden and the Chinese President, President Xi Jinping. Now, they're the leaders of the two largest economies in the world, but both President Biden and President Xi are facing a series of critical challenges. And over the last decade, strategic competition between Washington and Beijing has intensified as a result of Beijing's approach on a number of issues, to include the South China Sea and Taiwan, and other critical regional security matters and trade and human rights. But still, it's essential that we set up a framework that will enable the United States to compete effectively with China, to confront where necessary, but also to cooperate where desirable on such issues as pandemic prevention and climate change. And to achieve that balance, wise and determined U.S. leadership with China is needed. And today we have that leadership with us, who is one of the architects of the Biden administration's approach to navigating these daunting challenges. He's the youngest national security advisor to a sitting president in 60 years. And Jake's record is impressive in terms of both his experience in the administration, in the executive, and also in foreign policy. He's a Yale Law School graduate and a Rhodes Scholar, and President Biden could not have chosen better when he selected Jake Sullivan to be the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. I'll turn the floor over to Jake in just a moment for some introductory remarks, and we'll come together again for about 20 minutes of questions and answers on the U.S. approach to China. So, Jake, it's wonderful to have you with us today at Brookings, and the floor is yours, sir.
Well, thank you, John, for those generous remarks, and even more thank you for Brookings providing this platform for me to be able to read out the conversation between President Biden and President Xi last night, and then to have a conversation about some of the complex and difficult issues facing the U.S. China relationship. As you noted, last night, President Biden and President Xi Jinping met for several hours. It was a virtual meeting, but I can tell you, having been there, even virtually, the opportunity for the two men to look at each other, to see each other reacting, to engage in conversation was fundamentally different from phone calls. And they've had a couple of phone calls along the way here as presidents. But this was a more intense, engaged session that ran for more than 3 hours late into the evening last night. And I want to just take a few minutes to talk through what unfolded. But before I get into the discussion, I think it's important to step back and talk briefly about the context here. President Biden went into this meeting having spent 10 months in his foreign policy shaping the strategic environment so that he walked into this meeting in an effective position. 10 months of strong steps to invest in ourselves at home and to align with our allies and partners around the world. At home, we have been focused on replenishing the reservoirs of American strength so that since taking office, President Biden has made great strides against COVID-19 here in the United States, and now has taken the lead in the battle to beat COVID-19 globally. The House, as we speak, is moving forward this week on the most significant investment in working families in decades. And yesterday, just a few hours before he met with Xi Jinping, joined by members of both political parties, President Biden signed into law the largest investment, a bipartisan investment in American infrastructure in history. Looking abroad, President Biden has asserted American leadership anew. And just the last several weeks tell this story well. In September, he hosted the Quad Summit for the first time here in Washington and launched a new trilateral security partnership with Australia and the United Kingdom. In October, he participated in the U.S. ASEAN Summit and the East Asia Summit, reclaiming America's seat at the table in key institutions in the Indo-Pacific. In November, he returned from Europe after a successful trip that both cemented strong transatlantic ties and displayed American diplomatic muscle, helping deliver progress at COP26 and leading the world to a really important milestone that I think has not gotten enough attention, a global minimum tax on corporations that will end the race to the bottom and deliver much needed resources to working people in the United States and around the world. With our European partners, President Biden is establishing a blueprint for working together towards a positive vision of inclusive economic growth and innovation, whether that's striking a U.S.-EU agreement on steel and aluminum and ending a conflict that had erupted a couple of years ago, ending a 17-year dispute between Boeing and Airbus to set the terms for the civil aviation industry going forward, or launching the Trade and Technology Council. All of this is about working with like-minded partners to write the rules of the road for the 21st century in a way that advances our interests, reflects our values, and yes, pushes back on China's non-market economic practices. Meanwhile, in the Indo-Pacific, President Biden has now been previewing with key Indo-Pacific partners a new regional economic framework that will set new norms and standards in the digital space, that will strengthen our supply chains, increase our infrastructure investments, and facilitate trade. And throughout, he has strengthened our alliances with the Republic of Korea and Japan so that they are as strong as they have been in the history of those two alliances. That's the context for the meeting last night. That is the strategic environment into which President Biden walked when he went into the Roosevelt Room for that meeting. And it is the context in which President Biden outlined to Xi Jinping his administration's approach to foreign policy, and especially to setting the terms for an effective and healthy competition with China. It starts with first delivering on the deep investments that I discussed here at home, putting America and our allies and partners in a position to compete most effectively. It also means that as we think about competition, something I've said before and want to really reiterate, that intense competition requires intense diplomacy. And last night's meeting was part of that intense diplomacy, that there is no substitute for the kind of leader-level dialogue that President Biden and President Xi have engaged in over the course of many years and carried forward last night. The two leaders have had candid, direct, straightforward conversations in America, in China, going back nearly a decade. And those conversations have always been important, but they've never been more important than right now. There is no substitute for direct leader-to-leader engagement to prevent miscommunication about our goals and motives, our policies, and of course, to give direction to our respective governments. So last night, President Biden and President Xi shared directly with one another how they see relations between our countries and what we need to do to manage those relations responsibly. President Biden underscored that the United States has clear interests and values, a clear vision for the future, and he is committed to advancing and protecting them. He raised American concerns about China's practices in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong. He raised concerns about human rights more broadly, not directed at any one country, but directed to the fulfillment of a basic proposition that the president talks about, the opening words of the Declaration of Independence, that is written on parchment, but also written deep in our country's bones. And that was the spirit with which he approached the conversation on human rights with Xi Jinping. He was also clear about the need to protect American workers and industries from unfair trade and economic practices. And he sketched out what he meant by his substantive vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific. That include raising concerns about China's activities in the South and East China Seas and the central importance of freedom of navigation, overflight, and other responsible rules of the road to ensure stability and prosperity for the region that the United States has helped to underwrite for decades. The two leaders spent a good amount of time on the question of Taiwan. And President Biden underscored his commitment to the One China policy, which is guided by the Taiwan Relations Act, the 3 joint communiques, and the 6 assurances. He also reminded President Xi that he voted for the Taiwan Relations Act as a senator. And so he understands deeply, firsthand, that the act makes clear that any effort to shape Taiwan's future by other than peaceful means is of grave concern to the United States. President Biden and President Xi also discussed in detail a number of areas where miscommunication or miscalculation could lead to challenges in the relationship. President Biden was clear where he believed that certain of the PRC's actions are potentially destabilizing, and he stressed the need to develop ways to manage strategic risk and to put into place common sense guardrails to ensure that competition doesn't veer into conflict. President Biden often quotes his father on this point, who once said that the only conflict worse than one that's intended is one that's unintended. And he reinforced that point again to President Xi last night. Of course, he also spoke with President Xi about the need for the United States and China, as the two largest economies in the world, as two countries with capacities and responsibilities, to coordinate in order to address issues of global importance where our interests align. They discussed health security and counter narcotics, and especially climate change. And President Biden underscored that the US and China do bear responsibility for contributing to effective and durable solutions. In this regard, the two leaders welcomed the recent U.S. China joint statement at COP26. But President Biden underscored the need for that not to be the end of the story, but just another step along the way, and that more progress is necessary, accelerated progress, more intense action, especially in the 2020s during what President Biden has called this decisive decade in the fight against global climate change. They exchanged views on key regional challenges, including North Korea, Iran, and Afghanistan. And they also discussed a broad range of global economic issues, including how the United States and China can work together to ensure global energy supply and price volatility do not imperil the global economic recovery. The two presidents tasked their teams to coordinate on this issue expeditiously. On all of these issues, President Biden made clear that China's good faith coordination on global issues is not a favor to the United States, and we will not look at it as such. It is something that's expected of all responsible states, including the United States and China. The United States contributes to global problem solving out of our own national interest and our sense of responsibility to the larger common interest, not because China asks us to or does something for us, and we fully expect the same in reverse. To this point, as a responsible global leader, the United States knows that what we do and how we conduct ourselves in this competition has far-reaching effects on prosperity and security for the American people, yes, first and foremost, but for people around the world. This is a competition with global dimensions. It is taking place in technology, economics, global governance, and other spheres. President Biden has made clear that together with our allies and partners and those that share our democratic values, that we are going to work for a vision, not against China, but for an affirmative vision of an international system that remains free, open, and fair. We will compete with the full range of our strengths, and we're going to stand up for our values. Above all, we're going to tap that most American of capacities, the capacity for renewal and reinvention, rooted in this nation's and our people's resilience and innovation. We are dynamic, we are entrepreneurial, we have the ability to self-question and self-correct, and we are determined. As President Biden has said so many times, the investments we are making are about making a choice between competitiveness and complacency, and between leading the world and letting it pass us by. And there is no doubt in his mind and no doubt in my mind that the American people will rise to the challenge and shape the 21st century in a way that redeems our interests and our values. And that was the spirit with which he conducted himself last night. That is the spirit with which we will carry forward our policy towards China and our broader foreign policy in the world. And with that, I would be happy, John, to take your questions. Thank you.
Well, Jake, thank you for that really comprehensive readout. First, thank you for the overview of how the administration has been operating over the early months of the president's tenure, but also for that extensive readout. So given the fact that so many issues were touched in pretty comprehensive ways, Jake, what do you see as the next steps after this virtual leaders meeting to continue to develop the nuances and the dimensions of this relationship?
Well, I would put it into a few categories. One category are the areas where we need to closely coordinate because there our interests align and there is urgent work to carry forward. Climate and public health are two key issues in that bucket, and you mentioned both of them in your opening comments. There was an important breakthrough at COP in terms of the joint statement that John Kerry negotiated. That now needs to be implemented in an aggressive and dynamic way in the months ahead. When it comes to COVID-19, there are still very real questions about transparency and issues associated with the origins of COVID-19. But we also have to beat this pandemic in the months ahead, and that is going to require the United States, China, and the rest of the international community all working together in a way in which we are trying to vaccinate the world, not through extortion, not through demanding favors or concessions, but simply because it's the right thing to do and it's the smart thing to do. So that's bucket one. Bucket two are immediate challenges where the United States and China have worked together historically and are now facing important moments. The Iran nuclear issue is one of them. The negotiators will be back in Vienna at the end of the month, and the two presidents had the chance to talk about how we can align our perspectives heading into that meeting so that the P5+1 is united in dealing with Iran and trying to pave the way for a return to the JCPOA. And on North Korea, of course, we have seen a series of tests by North Korea. The United States has indicated we're prepared to engage good faith and diplomacy if North Korea is prepared to do the same. So coordination around that issue is also very important. The third bucket is how to effectively manage differences. And here, ensuring peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, having clear communication, avoiding miscommunication is going to be an important and intensive aspect of work between our militaries, between our national security councils, and between our diplomats. And so you will see at multiple levels an intensification of the engagement to ensure that there are guardrails around this competition so that it doesn't veer off into conflict. And then finally, in the economic domain, Ambassador Tai is now engaged with her counterpart in trying to ensure that we come to a good resolution on some of the issues remaining open in the phase one trade deal, even as we look at the full range of tools available to us to deal with China's non-market economic practices. And I mentioned in my opening comments, one of the things on which the United States and China will have to coordinate, not just in the weeks and months ahead, but literally in the days ahead, is how to deal with the global energy crunch and how the US and China as two major energy consumers can contribute to the assurance of a supply of energy that can push the global economic recovery forward rather than hold it back. So that's those are different categories, but they all fall under one common umbrella, which is what President Xi and President Biden really reinforced to one another at multiple points last night, was that this relationship needs to be guided by consistent and regular leader-to-leader interaction. And for that leader-to-leader interaction then to lead to a series of taskings to senior and empowered interlocutors on both sides who can engage not in dialogue for dialogue's sake, but on practical, tangible issues, one by one, to see where we can make progress and where we can't make progress, where we can ensure that we are reducing the possibility of friction and conflict.
Well, Jake, one of the questions I was going to ask, you touched it directly. They've known each other for a long time. And beyond the fact that they knew each other when the president was the vice president and Xi Jinping was rising in the party, they've also been on the phone a couple of times. So this is really one of the first times they've had a bilateral together. What was your sense of the atmospheric of this? Because as you said early in your comments, there's nothing like being face to face to get a sense of how a relationship could go. This is the most consequential relationship on the planet. And as this goes forward with this leadership by the Biden administration in reaching out to the Xi Jinping administration, how did you find the atmospherics in their personal relationship?
They are very familiar with one another. They've had many conversations. And one of the dynamics of when they talk now is that they both revert back to previous things that each of them have said. And by the way, not just to agree with one another, to disagree with one another as they're debating. One will say, well, as you said a few years ago, X or Y. So it has that kind of dynamic to it, which means it's not scripted. It's not just reading off talking points. there is actually a genuine give and take because, for lack of a better term, each of them has built up a body of work with the other that can be brought into the conversation. That's point one. Point two is they both recognize the weight of responsibility in stewarding the U.S. China relationship and in stewarding their respective foreign policies as two significant countries in the world. They take that very seriously, and they are looking to shoulder that weight responsibly, to take care in the words that they use, in the formulas they adopt, in the issues they put forward. But that leads me to point three. President Biden and President Xi as well, but especially President Biden, is always going to be Joe Biden. He is going to be direct and straightforward. And he's not going to sand down the edges of direct messages on hard issues, whether it's communicating to President Xi his concerns about destabilizing activities around the Taiwan Strait, or his deep belief in human dignity and human rights, or his advocacy on behalf of American workers and businesses who are being subject to unfair trade and economic practices. So there were sections last night that were incredibly direct, candid, and straightforward. And there was nothing about the session that led either side to try to cut corners in terms of being direct with one another about where we disagree. So I think that gives you a good sense of kind of what the atmosphere is like in the room. Obviously, when they finally get to actually be physically in the same place, that rapport and dynamic will allow for even fuller interchange. But this was a big and I think meaningful step forward from just talking on the phone. And I think both leaders benefited from it.
Jake, you've touched so many things this morning. Let me just touch one other issue. You touched on the security matters associated with Taiwan and the conversation that emerged from that South and East China Sea, potential hotspots or flare points. But we have heard the Chinese talk of late about the potential to add as many as hundreds of warheads to their nuclear arsenal. They are very clearly working through emerging technologies, particularly in the cyber domain and hypersonics, and of course the recent test of the fractional orbital bombardment system. Was there a discussion at all on how China and the United States can come together to address these issues? Because arms control, as we have traditionally known it, is much bigger now as an issue, and it spreads across the domains as well. And we're really the only two countries that have those kinds of capabilities. Was this a matter of discussion? And this will be your last answer, Jake. So thank you again for joining us.
John, it is a great question. These are sensitive and consequential issues that matter profoundly for America's national security, and how we effectively manage them with China, as how we effectively manage them with Russia, will be determinative of whether we are succeeding in stewarding this policy effectively or not. So without going into too much detail on incredibly sensitive issues, President Biden did raise with President Xi the need for a strategic stability set of conversations around the sorts of issues you just described, that needs to be guided by the leaders and led by senior empowered teams on both sides that cut across security, technology, and diplomacy. And the two leaders agreed that we would look to begin to carry forward discussions on strategic stability. Now, that is not the same as what we have in the Russian context with the formal strategic stability dialogue that is far more mature, has a much deeper history to it. There's less maturity to that in the U.S. China relationship. But the two leaders did discuss these issues, and it is now incumbent on us to think about the most productive way to carry it forward from here.
Well, Jake, thank you. And your point is so important. This is the most consequential relationship of the 21st century. It can only be successful for both our people, but more broadly the world, if it is leader-led, as you have said. Last night's conversation, which you have read out so wonderfully for us today, gives us confidence that there is a direction that China and the United States can have together, even during a moment of intense competition on a variety of issues where confrontation may emerge, but also where we should be seeking to cooperate as well. I want to thank you very much for taking the time after a long night last night to come and join us at Brookings to inform our audience today on these very important matters. Thank you for your overview at the beginning, and we wish you continued success as you continue in your very important duties serving the president and our country. Thank you very much, Jake.
Thank you, John, and thanks to everyone watching. Really appreciate it.
Our pleasure indeed.
Thank you, John, for conducting that conversation with Jake Sullivan. And thank you so much to Jake for joining us this morning and for your thoughtful remarks. Good morning again. Thank you so much to John for conducting the conversation with Jake Sullivan. And thank you to Jake for the very thoughtful remarks after a long night of dialogue on the president's meeting with President Xi and the broad U.S. approach to China. I'm really delighted to kick off the second portion of our on-the-record virtual session to discuss the implications of what is perhaps the most closely watched Zoom meeting in recent history between President Biden and President Xi, as well as the broader dynamics of U.S. China relations. I'm Suzanne Maloney, Vice President of the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings, and I'll now welcome quickly an all-star panel of Brookings experts who are each engaged in in-depth, nonpartisan research and publishing on issues related to China, trade, technology, and democracy. Jessica Brandt is Policy Director in the Brookings Artificial Intelligence and Emerging Technology Initiative and a Fellow in our Center for Security Strategy and Technology. Her work focuses on disinformation and digital authoritarianism. She was the lead author on a bipartisan task force published last year entitled Linking Values and Strategy: How Democracy Can Offset Autocratic Advances. Ryan Haas is a senior fellow in Brookings Center for East Asia Policy Studies, as well as our China Center. He holds both the Michael Armacost Chair as well as the Gu Chair in Taiwan Studies at Brookings. Ryan served as Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia in President Obama's National Security Council, and he's published two important new books in just the past few months: Stronger, Adapting America's China Strategy in an Age of Competitive Interdependence, and Global China, Assessing China's Growing Role in the World, which he co-edited with several Brookings colleagues. Dr. Chung Lee is Director of the John L. Thornton China Center at Brookings and a Senior Fellow in our Foreign Policy Program. His research focuses on generational change, the Chinese middle class, and technological development in China. He's the author or editor of numerous books and other publications, and his latest book, Middle Class Shanghai: Reshaping U.S. China Engagement, was published earlier this year. Finally, let me welcome Josh Meltzer, who's a Senior Fellow in Brookings Global Economy and Development Program, where he specializes in international trade law and policy issues. Like Ryan, Josh has also had a distinguished diplomatic career. Josh served in Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He now teaches digital trade law at Melbourne University Law School and has previously taught at Georgetown University and Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. So with that set of introductions, let me turn things over to our panel by asking for your assessment of the meeting between President Xi and President Biden. What did it achieve? Can it be judged a success on the relatively modest terms that the administration outlined in advance? And what does this signal for the likely trajectory of the bilateral relationship? Let me turn first to Ryan Haas, who of course has had some experience in setting up meetings like this. Ryan, if you would give us your assessment, and we'll move next in turn to Chung, Josh, and Jessica.
Well, Suzanne, thank you for moderating this discussion and bringing us all together. I'm excited for the conversation that we're going to have. My sense is that the best way to understand last night's meeting is to put it in a broader context and to situate it along the continuum of the relationship over the past 10 months. It's worth reminding ourselves that when Joe Biden entered office in January, the U.S. China relationship was effectively dysfunctional. There were no real functioning channels of communication between Washington and Beijing. And I think the dominant trait of the relationship at that time was confrontation through public condemnation in both directions. fast forward to last night, and I think what we've seen is an effort by leaders in Washington and Beijing to try to restore a bit of functionality to the relationship. And what we heard from Jake just now was to put a bit of a floor underneath the relationship. And so I don't think that either leader gave ground on their top interest or concerns. But I think that both sides seem to acknowledge that runaway escalation is in neither side's interest. So my sense is that both leaders used last night's meeting to try to release a little bit of pressure in the relationship and to give it a little bit more stabilization. And looking forward, my expectation is that domestic issues are going to dominate in both countries over the next year. And so what we've seen is that there is now a bit of a floor underneath the relationship. Given the domestic imperatives that both leaders have, I don't think that either leader is going to want to be perceived as softening in their approach to the relationship. And so that domestic imperative is going to put a pretty firm ceiling on the relationship as well. So I think that what we will see over the next year is the relationship traveling within this band of competition between the floor and the ceiling that have been established.
Well, Suzanne, thank you for moderating this panel. I'm honored to be part of this discussion with my Brookings colleagues, especially following the very important, insightful, and intellectually stimulating remarks by Jack and the conversation between Jack and John Allen. Now, to your frame question, Suzanne, I believe that the meeting was a success, a commendable success for both sides under very difficult circumstances. As we know, U.S. China relations have deteriorated in the past 2 or 3 years at a speed and scope beyond what could have been predicted. Not only has each side accused the other of being a genocidal regime and speculated that the COVID-19 pandemic originated from a lab leak in the other country, but the risk for military confrontation and war between both superpowers is also on the rise, especially given the possibility of incidents intended or unintended in the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea. Now, will this meeting become a turning point that puts the bilateral relationship back to a track? My answer is no, partly because the U.S.-China tensions at present reflect profound changes in the geopolitical landscape, and adapting to this change is not easy, partly because some deep-rooted differences between the two countries, as Jack very insightfully laid out, and partly because President Biden lacks the political capital at home to warm up relations with this perceived formidable competitor or even rival. Now, but this meeting could ease or alter the current alarming dial path toward U.S.-China confrontation. The meeting has sent a message around the world, not just to China and United States, that the recent tension in this most consequential bilateral relationship, as John used the term a number of times in today's world, do not necessarily imply what some analysts have called a free fall or a vertical fall, nor should we have a fatalistic view about the inevitability of hegemonic conflict or war. This is a very rational, reciprocal, and responsible move by leaders in both countries, which should resonate well among the international community. Over to you, Suzanne. Or Jessica?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in next unless Josh wanted to take the mic.
Yeah, no, sure. I was, it's great to be here with colleagues, and thanks, Suzanne, for putting this together. Look, I fundamentally agree with everything that Ryan and Cheng Li have said. I think, look, for me, addressing, I guess, the trade and economic dimensions, I mean, there was very little mention of that, of course, and none was to be expected. I think it's fairly well understood what the positions are on this. And I also think it reflects really a realization that there's not going to be a lot of progress, I think, bilaterally on the trade and economic relationship for the time being. And this, I think, reflects a couple of things that, came out very clearly, I think, in the meeting, and that Jake Sullivan, made clearer just before, which is the focus on the domestic agenda, which is very much obviously about putting the US in the position where it can most ably compete. And that is really about laying the foundations also for a better outcome, I think, on trade, both economically and ultimately politically. And, a shift away, I think, diplomatically from, these previous intensive focuses on the bilateral sort of diplomacy on the trade and economic side, and a more sort of clearer focus on setting the terms internationally by working more closely with allies. And so we heard Jake refer to the administration's discussions now with allies on a new Indo-Pacific sort of economic framework. We've seen what's been happening with Europe and so far. So the administration's been clearly trying to set the terms for the economic environment globally as a way of sort of setting the terms for future discussions with China, but I think these are a way off. So we saw nothing on the hot button topic of tariffs, and none were to be expected. We know that Ambassador Tai has reaffirmed the United States' commitments to the phase 1 deal, and the key issue there is Chinese compliance with its purchase commitments. And I think that's actually a really key outcome for the United States, because one of the things I think which has not gone reported on enough about this decision, which I think is fundamentally important here, is the decision by the administration not to walk away from a trade agreement simply because it was done by the previous administration. I think the cost to US credibility by the Trump decision to just simply pull out of the TPP without much reflection or justification really undermined, I think, other governments' sort of sense that they can rely on US administration when it comes to international economic policy, that it flops from administration to administration, and sort of putting a line under that sand is what I think is an important step. And then I think it really falls now onto trying to demonstrate compliance. So I think that'll be one area where we'll see ongoing attention. We know that the USTR is looking at whether there are other tools that they need to use to address unfair trade practices. There'll be some cooperation and discussion in the WTO, but I don't think we'll see much more beyond that at the moment.
Let me also add my thanks to Suzanne and to this group for this conversation. I see the situation along some of the same lines that Josh does when it comes to values and technology issues. I mean, I think as others have noted, this wasn't a meeting that was intended to produce concrete deliverables or outcomes. And areas of difference were certainly on the agenda, and that included, China's human rights practices and its approach to technology. But I think, when it comes to these values questions, this is not a place where either side has a lot of room to maneuver. And so, ahead of the meeting, the administration said that they're not sort of trying to change China's behavior through using bilateral engagement, but rather trying to shape the international environment more broadly. And I think, with that in mind, that most of the important activity on technology and values issues are happening in other fora like the Quad and the TTC, which we saw a lot of activity on earlier this year.
Great. Well, thanks to all of you for putting a lot of issues on the table to start with. And we have just under a half an hour still to go. So let me get right to the heart of the matter. One of the questions on everyone's mind, I think, around this meeting, and of course, in the context of the bilateral relationship between Beijing and Washington, is the question of Taiwan. And of course, in some of the media who are watching this issue and who submitted questions for our event this morning, including Andrea Mitchell from NBC News and Camilla Schick from CBS News, this question of Taiwan really seems to loom large. Ryan, you described a kind of ceiling and floor on the U.S.-Chinese relationship. Will the floor hold when it comes to Taiwan? What do we have in terms of guardrails or crisis management systems in place to manage the potential for escalation there? And something you've written about, what is it that we can do to help maintain and strengthen Taiwan's credible deterrence against China?
Well, I mean, Suzanne, thank you. These are profound questions. It's interesting putting the American readout and the Chinese readout side by side in how each side characterized both their own and the other side's positions on the discussion of Taiwan. In the American readout, it indicates that President Biden reiterated longstanding positions, including the fact that the United States opposes any unilateral changes to the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. The Chinese readout warned that anyone who plays with fire will get burnt, which is pretty provocative language to use in this type of setting, particularly against the backdrop of the type of atmosphere that was evident that Jake described just a moment ago. But the readout also indicates that President Biden indicated that he does not support Taiwan independence, which again is a longstanding position of the United States. So why is Beijing choosing to put so much emphasis on this point? I think they're doing so because they're frustrated. They're frustrated for two reasons. One, that the United States continues to demonstrate visibly its support for Taiwan. And I think that from Beijing's perspective, they believe that it emboldens and gives confidence to the people of Taiwan in their own future, and challenges their efforts to isolate and intimidate Taiwan. The second reason is that I think they're frustrated by the Biden administration's progress in internationalizing the Taiwan issue. We've seen Taiwan discussed when President Biden has met with Japanese leaders, South Korean leaders, with the G7 leaders, with Quad leaders. There's been a real effort to raise awareness of the international stakes of Taiwan security, again, in a way that frustrates Beijing's efforts to isolate and intimidate Taiwan and to treat Taiwan as a feature of U.S. China competition. And at the end of the day, the United States is not going to abandon Taiwan. Taiwan is an issue that enjoys broad and deep support, both with the executive branch of the United States government, as well as legislative branch, as well as a feature of bipartisan support between Democrats and Republicans. So when American leaders talk about rock solid support for Taiwan, this isn't a passing trend. This is part of a longstanding trend. And at the same time, look, I think it's important for the two leaders to have a direct, candid conversation with each other so that they can both leave the meeting with a clear awareness of the strength of each side's convictions about this issue. At the end of the day, to try to get back to your original question, Suzanne, the United States and China have been able to manage this issue as an element of their bilateral relationship for the past 40 plus years. I remain confident that they'll continue to be able to do so. In large part because the stakes of their failure to do so would be so profound. But we can't be complacent about this issue. We have to take it seriously and deal with it with the urgency it deserves.
Thanks, Ryan. Chung, I'd like to turn to you now to say a few words about China's domestic politics and how this meeting and the broader question of bilateral dynamics between Washington and Beijing are playing into what is seems to be a very interesting moment in the evolution of President Xi's tenure and the overall system of power in China. What do you see happening on the ground? How do you think that this is going to shape the overall approach to foreign policy, and in particular, the prospects for the relationship with Washington, as we see really a trend toward cementing Xi's rule and toward growing authoritarianism in China?
Well, Suzanne, thank you so much for that, for raising that important question. As both Ryan and Joshua said earlier, foreign policies are increasingly driven by domestic politics. It is interesting that President Xi Jinping began his remarks in this video, kind of discussion meeting by saying, I quote, "We should each run our domestic affairs well." Now, end quote. This is not just directed toward the international audience. Xi Jinping said similar things in a recent important official meeting in Beijing, that China must be clear-headed about the long-term and the complex nature of both domestic and international unfavorable factors. This is the direct term Xi Jinping used. Under such difficult situations, the most important thing for China is to do its own job well. Now, this is another quote from Xi Jinping. Now, China faces a multitude of daunting challenges, and including economic disparity, the potential bursting of a property bubble, unemployment pressure, the misuse of power by officials, frequent social protests, environment degradation, resources scarcity, food safety, and public health security issues. The Chinese leadership seems to be keenly aware of these challenges and understand the imperative to deal with them. Now, on top of that, the coming year is an important year with the leadership transition at the 20th Party Congress next fall. Although Xi Jinping himself, almost for sure, will serve a third term as the top leader in the party state. About half to 2/3 of officials at all levels of leadership will be changed in the year. So that's that's certainly it's not new. I mean, every 5 years they will do the same thing. This one is one of them. And so you can see the tremendous tensions or uncertainties in that regard. Now, as before, this will be a politically sensitive period. And from the perspective of Chinese authorities, it's in their best interest to maintain social political stability and have a conducive external environment. Now, Chinese leadership also understand that the growing nationalistic or nationalism and anti-American sentiment in the country can be a double-edged sword. By the way, some friends in China have told me that in the past few days, suddenly nobody in the country posts anti-American social media pieces now. So I think this is the ground observation about the effect of this meeting. I hope that will be a lasting one, and certainly I think both countries should focus their own domestic affairs, domestic challenges. Over to you.
Great. Let me turn next to Josh. You made some interesting remarks about essentially the relatively modest place that trade issues held in this dialogue that took place last night, and about the effective way that the United States is approaching these key differences, essentially in terms of trying to shape the environment globally and regionally, rather than necessarily sort of trying to craft a different approach to the specific trade policy that was put in place by the Trump administration. There's obviously a lot of frustration on both sides over the perpetuation of these tariffs. Do you see any real progress happening either over the medium or long term in terms of improving the U.S. China trade relationship? And what are the most effective tools that the administration can use to try to affect that?
Yeah, great question, Susan. How long do we have? But I think, look, at some level, the relationship is better because we're not in the previous 4 years of sort of chest thumping and sort of trial by media, and a lot of build up around what was to be expected in terms of the leverage the US had generated by all these tariffs, and actually, frankly, what was a very sort of low-key deal in the phase one outcome. And so just sort of tamping down the temperature and trying to focus on what really matters for the US, I think is sort of a really important starting point. Everyone's made clear that domestic politics are going to be constrained. This will be absolutely key when it comes to the trade and economic relationship. So I think I don't think there's an appetite on the administration's part to really lower tariffs in any substantial way on China. USTR did say they're going to look more closely at a more effective exclusion process, which means that if you can demonstrate that you can't effectively source elsewhere, you might be able to get a tariff exclusion. And I think that will help businesses, particularly those who are using key inputs from China into their kind of supply chain. So that will take some of the sort of economic pressure off specific industries. But I don't think there is really an environment where we're going to see some dramatic lowering of tariffs. I think for the time being, the key challenge really is going to be, you've got what still remains, despite some reduction from very high levels, a very integrated economic relationship. And I mean, I think the trade levels were around 550 billion last year during COVID. The trend is a little bit down, but it's still extremely high. And so the question really, I think, is fundamentally still, how do you manage that economic interdependence, where both sides, are prepared to use that interdependence to weaponize to essentially achieve other foreign policy goals? The US has been using that clearly with respect to China. That's what we saw in the last 4 years of Trump. China's clearly acutely aware of that sort of exposure, particularly along the technology supply chain, and so has a policy now of seeking greater independence. But how do you do this in a way which doesn't blow up the relationship, but deals with the national security concerns that do arise because of that economic independence? We don't have a clear answer to that. I think a core part of that is going to be where ultimately we land on the export control piece that's going through the Department of Commerce around what are emerging and critical technologies, and what that definition ultimately looks like, around the investment screening piece as well. The cooperation with allies here will be absolutely essential, because none of this will ultimately be effective and will simply hurt US companies if it's not done in sort of cooperation with the key allies who also possess the technologies that could also end up in China. And so making sure that allies are on the same page, and we've seen that in the TTC context, we've seen that in the Quad context. So that's clearly, I think, on the agenda as well. And then the final piece that the US administration needs to think through, and we got some indication from Jake Sullivan that they're in the process of doing that, is how do they re-engage in a more substantial way in the Indo-Pacific region? We've seen China put up its hand to join the CPTPP as probably the most significant outcome. The deeper is another digital agreement they want to join. These are sort of strategic moves on a chessboard that China is making at the moment, which would effectively, I think, block any chance of US rejoining those agreements. I don't think that was ever seriously probably on the cards for the US anyway. But, you do have a picture in the Indo-Pacific of China essentially being part of the core sort of trade architecture and the US not being part of it. And whatever one thinks about the commercial importance of these agreements, the optics is terrible. And I think that needs to be addressed. So the announcement and the expectation that we're going to see a new framework for US engagement in the Indo-Pacific and that these discussions are underway with allies, I think is a really important first step. And I expect to see a lot more of that in the future. And as I mentioned, this will be, I think, the setting of the stage which will ensure that the US and allies are best placed to compete, to invest, to trade, and to minimize the cost of Chinese economic practices, which will lay the groundwork for, I think, engaging with China over the medium to longer term on these issues.
Thanks, Josh. I want to stay on this question of shaping the environment and in particular the sort of efforts of both sides to align allies through both formal and informal architecture. And specifically, Jessica, I'd welcome your views on the US approach to technology competition. You've written that China has effectively integrated technology throughout its national security policy. How is it that the United States is trying to shape the environment globally and regionally for a more successful competition with China around technology?
Sure. Yeah, I think this is like the question. And so, I think the first thing to do is to acknowledge the nature of the competition, which is that it's persistent and that it's asymmetric, and that it's happening, in domains, as Jake Sullivan said himself, that are sort of far from traditional battlefields, right? In spheres including technology. I think technology is probably the most intense domain of competition because it underpins so many of the other domains. So we first have to acknowledge that it's asymmetric, and then identify sort of asymmetric advantages of our own. And then use them, I guess, to frame the competition on our own terms. And I think, there's sort of three big buckets of things we have to do and are beginning to make progress on. And the first one is protecting and strengthening the sort of sources of our competitiveness. And so that, requires a broad range of activities, everything from, ensuring that we can attract and retain innovators. So smart and sound immigration policies, investing in critical technologies, and then protecting critical technologies with export controls, which is, Josh laid out is an important endeavor. Then there's sort of updating like bureaucratic processes and norms so that we're on a footing where we can be tactical in our responses. And so that looks like, creating ways for tech talent to come to government. And that's going to mean, maybe exchanges with the private sector, things like reforming acquisition processes that make it really hard to adopt new technologies on the time frame that, on the pace of change. And then integrating tech policy considerations, across government, which I think is a place actually that this administration has made big strides. And then last but not least is then leveraging those asymmetric advantages of our own and competing in the places that are, sort of most conducive to our success and doing this in partnership with allies. So things like pooling talent and resources, conducting joint R&D, coordinating on norm setting. And again, these are also places I think, the administration has made the greatest strides, including in formats like Quad and TTC.
Suzanne, can I just jump in real quick?
Jump in.
I just want to foot-stomp what Jessica said because I think it's so important. Technology really is at the core of the competition that exists between the United States and China today. And I think that the point that she's making is so critical that we both need to play defense in guarding against the leakage or export of dual-use technologies that could come back to do harm to us, or to aid and abet human rights abuses in China or elsewhere. But it's so important that we play offense as well. And I think Jessica has laid out a very practical sort of framework and playbook for us to do so. I think that's where this administration is trying to take things so that we do play to our strengths, that we do take advantage of our advantages, including our openness, which is so critical. And as part of that, I think it's really important that we keep in mind that being able to attract the best and the brightest talent is one of the most powerful things the United States can do in its long-term competition with China.
Really important point, Ryan. Thanks for jumping in there. I want to come back to the meeting itself. Obviously, this is just sort of one data point, one moment in what is clearly a very consequential relationship, one that's evolving in real time. But there was a lot of emphasis, I thought, in Jake's remarks, perhaps deliberately for the audience, around this kind of, what the centrality of the kind of leader to leader dialogue. And how do they sustain that if that's true, given the restrictions around particularly Chinese traveling, the need to quarantine when individuals return to China, which has apparently thus far precluded President Xi from opportunities to meet directly with President Biden? How do you sustain a dialogue, and how do you build upon this channel of communications, which, as Jake and John both noted, really does draw on some significant past experience between the two leaders? I thought it was notable that President Xi apparently referred to President Biden as an old friend, which has been a description that Biden himself has shrugged off. But I'd just be curious, in this very unique and almost unprecedented environment that we're all facing, how any of you might think about what we can do to build upon the meeting itself for a more effective channel on any of the issues that have come up: Taiwan, technology, trade, but of course also so many others. And this is really open to whomever grabs the mic first. Chung, over to you.
Well, it's very interesting that Xi Jinping called President Biden an old friend, and Biden said that you and I should not be that formal, because both leaders met 11 times, and Biden visited China 4 times. I think it's 3 times also. He met with Xi Jinping because both of them were vice president at the time. And also they traveled together, and Biden actually implied that we should travel. They went to Los Angeles in the US and also Sichuan, and together. And they have numerous phone calls. And before, I remember that 10 years ago when Bo-Xilai incident took place and Biden was vice president, I think Ryan Haas probably was in the White House or in the embassy. There's a lot of communication at that crisis. So I think it's very, very important to maintain this kind of high level. Sometimes, unfortunately, it's by Zoom. But there's a very interesting signal from Xi Jinping's speech. He said that China will consider kind of provide a green access, let the foreign business people to enter China. Now, this is the first time he used that term, because China is control the border issues and the COVID. People, I think it's probably too excessive, a lot of criticism within China and also outside China. So whether this will be a signal that eventually China will open up, let more people, students, foreign business people, and people like a think tank like ours to have one person-to-person meeting. But at this point, I think, unfortunately, maybe fortunately, we still have the Zoom, have a lot of techniques, have communication. And as you know, under your leadership, they will have a lot of dialogue with Chinese counterparts, with the other countries, particularly with Europe, with Asian countries. I think this is, it's kind of an unfortunate substitute, but hopefully that the collaboration this time, because this is the first time in my view that both leaders talk about the future possibility cooperate on public health, and not so much indulge with the past, point finger to each other, but rather how to prevent, how to play important role in this in today's world, whether it be vaccine development, drug development, and also the international norm and the regulations. Over.
Suzanne, I think that your point is accurate, that we are in uncharted territory. There is no real precedent for how to manage a complex relationship without the ability to meet face to face. But I would say that U.S. and China seem to be making strides in this regard. If you think about where we were at the start, when our senior officials met in Anchorage, to where we are when Jake Sullivan and Yang Jiechi met in Zurich, to where we are last night, there has been an ability to close gaps in expectations. And I think this is important because in the history of U.S.-China relations, whenever the gap in expectations is widest, the room for turbulence is or the potential for turbulence is greatest. When the gap in expectations narrows, there's usually more stability in the relationship and a little bit more functionality to it. Now, that doesn't solve the problems that are sort of embedded in the relationship, but it makes it more manageable. And it's clear that there was a clear sort of theory of the case on both sides, that both sides shared in how each leader would approach their conversation last night. That was reflected in the opening statements that both made in front of the press. They both had pretty convergent themes and tones to their opening statements, but also in a lot of the elements that Jake described as well. So I think that we are making strides between the United States and China in our ability to close this gap in expectations. And I expect that we will continue to see sort of the pattern that we saw in the run up to this meeting play out going forward, which is that the two leaders meet, they identify key priorities, they designate empowered officials to follow up on those priorities, and then they meet again to push things forward. So after sort of a bumpy start, the edges are being sanded down, and I think we're getting into a pattern here.
I might just add, I took a quick look at China's state media this morning to see how they had covered the events of the last 24 hours. And the answer is quite responsibly. I think it really saw a markedly different tone than the way that we've seen Wolf Warrior diplomats talk about things like COVID origin and other serious issues. So I think that is a sign about how the administration is thinking about this going forward.
Jessica, let me keep you in the hot seat for just a few more moments, and also turn to Josh as well. I'd welcome your views on, how high the ceiling can go effectively, to keep with the analogy that Ryan used at the outset of our conversation. There are many who look at particularly around human rights and also around economic freedom and opportunity, who look at this bilateral relationship as really a competition between two systems. Is that accurate, either in the values domain or in the trade domain? And if so, how do we approach it? So I'll turn first to Jessica, and then Josh, if you have any thoughts on this, or frankly, the rest of the panel, love to hear your views.
Sure, happily. I do. I think it is a competition of systems. I think there's sort of two big debates. One is is resurgent geopolitical competition rooted in this clash of governance systems between openness and authoritarianism? And then the second question is, how much is the sort of liberal democratic model, how much is our behavior driving China's behavior? And if so, what, if anything, should we do about that? And so I guess my own view is quite shaped actually by our Brookings colleague, Tom Wright, who I think very accurately points out that, for Beijing, our behavior is inherently threatening. Open democratic societies and liberal systems have these characteristics that are inherently threatening, because human rights organizations call into question their legitimacy, and free and open media environments bring to light failures and false promises, and social media sort of loosens the grip over information and over societies generally. And I guess leaders have reacted to this by increasing repression, and they use technological tools in order to do that, and the result is negative externalities for us. So at the end of the day, we both pose challenges to one another just by being who we are, and I don't see that changing. I mean, I think the one place that maybe these parties agree most is that we don't want a new Cold War, and I think this summit or meeting reflects a desire not to let the relationship slip in that direction. And of course, there are important differences between the Cold War, right? Like a very large and complex trade relationship that Josh is about to talk about. And I also don't think that Beijing is primarily motivated by exporting ideology. It's about making the world it's not about converting the world to its worldview, but about making the world safe for its worldview. And that's also a key difference. But anyway, I'll let Josh chime in. I'm also curious for others' thoughts about, the nature of this competition.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Jess said, and I think it's a great question, Susan, and it's a difficult one because yes, I mean, I think fundamentally there are different value systems at stake and clearly different forms of governance. And let me just actually point out another one that really kind of makes it challenging in the economic sphere, which is this increasing difficulty of distinguishing between what is public and what is private in China, which is something we sort of take for granted. It's never that clear as one might think even here, but it's extremely unclear in China. And so, that means that a lot of a forum where one thinks that you're negotiating or working with businesses with sort of market motivated approaches might actually also be carrying out various forms of sort of government strategy and agendas. So it's challenging, but having said that, it doesn't, I think, necessarily preclude opportunities and avenues for working together. President Biden talks about this notion of sort of effective guardrails. And so when I sometimes think a little bit about that, at the end of the day, as I mentioned, we've got this robust sort of economic and trade relationship, and a lot of that will sustain itself, right? So the question, I think, for the US is how does that sort of grow in a way which doesn't imperil national security? So if you take, for instance, the people-to-people links, which we've talked about, which I agree are absolutely essential for US innovation and growth going forward. And if you look at AI, where we've been doing a lot of work, China has been a big player in the innovation space there. And you don't want to simply shut that down, but you want to be aware that this is going to be a vector for opportunities to get access to sensitive US technology and know-how. But there seems to me that there are processes we could put in place here that would effectively minimize that risk, screen out the people coming from China who are sort of effectively trying to carry out, party, agendas and allow in more, genuine research and cooperation. Similarly, on the students front, when it comes to investment bilaterally, we may have some concern about investment into supporting China's technology, in particular sensitive sectors, and we may want to sort of actually not only screen inbound investment, but have another look at outbound US investment. But this is going to be an area, if applied appropriately and in a sort of focused way, means that there still should be a fairly broad range of activity in the investment space, which can continue to grow. And I think that will also, be true on the trade front. So I think that the challenge is going to be, given the differences which I think are built in, and we don't expect any of that to change, how do we effectively put in place policies which minimize the risks to the US on the national security side, which is really, I think, as we've said, fundamentally about getting at the technology piece. That is the most sensitive part of the bilateral economic relationship. That's the one area where we need to be most careful. But I think we can do that. I mean, it's going to be challenging, as we've seen, with the difficulty defining out what we do in the export control sector, but I don't think it's beyond our capacity to do that.
Chung, I see you want to get into the conversation, please.
Yeah, and I just want to add one thing. There's a tendency that, we see the emergence of two blocks in terms of trade economic two systems, to IT and the internet system, to navigation system, the GPS versus Beidou, and the two military and ideological blocks. And we need to ask, is that the world we want? Of course, U.S. China has different culture, different political system, and et cetera, that Jessica said so well. But whether these kind of value differences, ideological differences, are like the former Soviet Union in the United States, is like the zero-sum game. One wants to destroy the other. Or as again, that H. Biden and his top advisor said that we should also avoid zero-sum game, and Chinese leaders certainly also echo that. So I think that also for many parts of the world, many other countries, including Europe and Asia, they do not necessarily want to take a side. Of course, in terms of value, into many other things, they want to. They certainly lean towards the United States, but in terms of economic development and the global common, they certainly hope that China will play an important role. So I think that the danger is these kind of blocks will not stop there, will be dangerous to lead to confrontation. So I think this video meeting actually tried to stop that. So I just want to add that that concern for both sides, and to think about this kind of tension or competition, try to avoid lead to this kind of two blocks.
Suzanne, I don't want to be the freeloader that rides on the coattails of all these bright comments. So I'll try to just offer one quick addition to what they've said, because I think that the question you're raising is sort of central to how we think about the U.S. China relationship. We often talk about competition, but rarely pause to think about what precisely we are competing over. And I think essentially what we are competing over is to demonstrate which governance system and social system is most capable of delivering results, most capable of unlocking the potential of its people, most capable of accelerating innovation and economic growth, most capable of galvanizing global efforts to address transnational challenges. That's essentially what the United States and China are competing over. Both countries believe that their governance system is best poised to meet the challenges of the 21st century, and may the best system prevail. As an American, I remain highly confident that the United States is well positioned in this competition. I also am cognizant of the fact that some of the tools that we used previously aren't available to us now. Containment is not an option when over 100 countries consider China their top trading partner, for example. So we're going to need to be pragmatic and sort of play to our own strengths. But if we do so, I think we'll be just fine over time in our ability to compete with China.
Well, thank you all. We have not had an opportunity to get to all the topics on the table, certainly not all the topics that were discussed in the 3+ hours between President Xi and President Biden yesterday evening. But I really want to thank our speakers, Dr. Chung Lee, Ryan Haas, Jessica Brandt, and Josh Meltzer in the order that you appear on my screen. I also want to thank all those of you who've been watching over the course of the past hour and a quarter. We really appreciate your attention and your engagement in the many, many questions that you sent in. We have tried to build into this conversation. I will also thank several people behind the scenes, Adriana Pita and Emily Kimball from our Central Communications and our Foreign Policy staff, as well as Trevor and Dan, who've been managing the audiovisual on our side. And let me just, as I close, thanking all the participants, all the audience, also just flag for those of you who have been watching that we'll have another event by the Brookings Foreign Policy Program tomorrow between 2 and 3 o'clock Eastern Time. Our colleagues Patricia Kim, Caitlin Talmadge, Melanie Sasson, Tom Wright, and Mike O'Hanlon will be joining in a discussion on one of the other issues that we haven't had an opportunity to talk in great depth about over the course of the past few moments, the future of strategic stability between the United States, China, and Russia. So please join us tomorrow at 2 p.m. Thank you all, and thanks so much to our speakers today.
All right, we are all clear.